Hey friends, it's Kurt from Transformative Journeys. I'm with you today to follow up on the trip that I just completed. I did manage to post a couple of videos from the road, although the last one was unfortunately truncated. I'll see if I can avoid doing that today, or at least notice it if I do. So yeah, I got back 2 days ago. The trip did not turn out the way I had originally planned. When I was planning it, going up into I guess it's really central British Columbia, where my sister lives, my plan, because I like to avoid traffic and I like to see unfamiliar roads, was to travel up the east side of the mountains, go over to the east side of the Sierra, and then travel up the east side of the Cascades. Sort of along 395, not sticking strictly to 395, and I was going to follow that up into Canada and get up to her home that way. However, with the heat that came in and then the fires, that began to look like a not such a good idea. And so I ended up deciding that I was going to go up, stand towards the coast side in order to stay out of the heat and hopefully the smoke, although I didn't entirely succeed in that. And so I traveled up 101, and then I got off 101 in Oregon when it got too frustrating for me with people racing for the passing lane and then parking when there is no passing lane. And I went off to the inside of the Coast Range, but not quite into the Willamette Valley, in order to get up through Oregon, and it was great. Went through some wonderful areas. And eventually then in Washington, similarly, after spending a night, where did I spend it? Castle Rock, known for the TT. I went ahead and did some back roads, and I ended up on 101 again, this time going up the east side, because in Washington State, the Olympic Peninsula, 101 actually goes around it. It forms a loop. And so I went up the east side of the loop and alongside Hood Canal, and then took a ferry over to Whidbey Island, and then went up into Canada. And there were a couple places, both on day one, shortly before I got to my overnight. I spent the first night in Brookings, and shortly before I got to Crescent City, I began to get a little bit of rain, but there was all this glop coming onto my visor, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. I didn't figure it out until I stopped. It was ash. It was from one of the big fires, and it was just being, cleansed out of the air a little bit by the drizzling rain, but it ended up all over my bike, all over my visor. And then my last full day of riding in Canada was going up through the last full day on the way up of riding in Canada, as I was going through the Fraser River Canyon near Lytton and on up into Cache Creek. Then it got really smoky. I actually saw fires that were underway, and saw all the firefighting, and ended up pulling over and putting on an N95 mask because the smoke was so thick. I was glad I had some of those N95s left from the pandemic. The trip back, I decided to try something a little bit different, because going through the interior still was not working. Southeastern BC was all aflame. Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon really bad. And of course, while I was gone, that park fire up by Chico, which might have been on my path if I had taken Highway 32, was all going on. So again, I decided to stay out on the coast side. This time up in BC, between, I can't remember the name of the place where the junction is, but it's between Clinton and Cache Creek. I got off onto 99 going towards Lillooet, and then towards Pemberton, and then towards Whistler. And I'd never ridden that road before, and I really enjoyed it up through about Pemberton. There was still some pretty good and interesting road from the time I got to Pemberton, but I was there on a weekend, a Sunday, if I recall. And there was just loads and loads and loads of traffic, particularly once I got to Whistler. The ride from Whistler down to West Vancouver wasn't particularly fun. And I ended up taking a ferry over to Vancouver Island, and that from Horseshoe Bay I went to Nanaimo, and that was really fun. That was a really good time. Had a chat with a lot of other riders who were waiting for the ferry. and spent the night on Vancouver Island, and then came down to Port Angeles the next day, west side of the Olympic Peninsula. Again, a lot of nice riding. I beg your pardon. It was Saturday when I was coming down through Whistler. So it was Sunday on the west side, and by that time, most of the people who live in big population areas in Washington were probably on their way home. So they were probably heading back inland. The traffic was not bad at all on the west side of 101. It was quite pleasant. And then spent the night in Aberdeen. Got up the next morning to a steady rain. That was not fun, and rode in it almost all day. I thought I was gonna ride out of it looking at the weather forecast, but I didn't ride out of it until almost the end of the day, down well south of Reedsport. So I traveled all the way down the Oregon coast. Not a lot of fun. A lot of my waterproof gear, if you ride in it long enough, I hadn't adequately re-waterproofed it after the last time I cleaned it. So that's something I've been doing this week. But what I want to talk to you about, really, what the whole point of the trip's about, and what really was highlighted on that day in the rain on the Oregon coast, was that even when it's not an intentional pilgrimage, and this wasn't really something I was viewing as a pilgrimage, some of the same stuff still happens, especially if you put yourself out there. And it's a little bit easier, I think, to sense it when you travel solo, frankly. But so when I was on my way up into BC, I was in a town called Hope. And another rider came up to me in a gas station while I was filling up early in the morning, getting ready for a long day up to my sister's place. Turns out that where my sister lives, I think of as being quite out of the way and really hard to get to. And I'm surprised when people know it. But not only did he know the lake that my sister and her husband live on, but he had relatives who had previously had a resort on the other side, and he spent his childhood there, and he had a lot to say about it. I thought, wow, that's pretty unusual. But on my way back home, similarly, on that rainy, awful day from in my case, from Aberdeen, Washington to Crescent City, California, I was stopped because I was confused by some road signs, and I was trying to, in the rain, get my cell phone to show me the map. And I stopped in the parking lot of a Willapa Bay National Wildlife Refuge in Washington State, Southwest Washington. And a ranger came up to me, and we started talking, and he was asking about where I was going, where I'd been, blah, 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 blah. And it turns out that his family had also had a resort on this same lake, and that he had spent part of his childhood on this same lake. I find these sort of circumstances, the coincidences of them, the serendipity of them, I think it was Carl Jung who called it the synchronicity of them, happens a lot on these kind of trips. And this wasn't the only time, but those were two really standout times on this trip where I experienced this synchronicity of people who are in my path who seemed like the most improbable people to meet, and yet there they were. This is one of the reasons why I think doing this is so worthwhile. It's so helpful. It's such a great way to connect with your fellow human beings. It's such a great way to find out more about yourself. I find that these experiences happen when I am so tired, fatigued, cold, whatever, that I like to put it that my armor's knocked off, that I become approachable, that there's something vulnerable in what I'm doing. And other people respond to that vulnerability with vulnerability of their own. And they share stuff, they take risks. This is a really wonderful way